Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Joe Hall. I'm Director of Community Engagement here at SFU's Woodward's building. Real delight to welcome Justin Langlois here on the talk Uselessness and Antagonism, Suggestions for a New Engagement. Before I introduce Justin, I just wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Before I introduce Justin, for some of you who haven't been here before, there's about 250 public events that happen here, talks. Right now, Vancouver International Film Festival is happening. I just want to highlight a couple of events that are coming up in the next few weeks. Next Wednesday, there's going to be a talk by Ricardo Bosbaum and also opening of his work downstairs in the O'Dane Gallery. October the 18th, a part of the Wrong Wave Festival with Unit Pit Gallery Mechanormal will be playing in this room at 8 p.m. On the 21st, Tuesday night, Jordan Strom from the Surrey Art Gallery will be giving a talk on the art scene in the suburbs. And the following Saturday, we have a yellow school bus that we've rented, and for the cheap price of $10, there's going to be a visit up to Presentation House Gallery, SFU Galleries, and out in Surrey. I just want to also acknowledge Andrea Creamer, who works with me, who will be on the bus with Stephen Tong, taking that up, and I think they're going to have a dinner at the end of that night as well, somewhere in Surrey. On the 22nd of October, we're going to be having a discussion on Glenn Coulthard's new book, Red Skin, White Mass, very important new book that's come out of University of Minnesota Press. Glenn teaches at UBC in the First Nations Studies Department and Political Science, so it should be a very excellent discussion. And the following Wednesday, Benjamin Bratton from the Center for Design and Geopolitics will be speaking on the stack, part of his theoretical work. It's been circulating in the visual art world as well on eFlux and other places, so hopefully you can make it. Tonight, a great pleasure to introduce Justin. He's an artist, educator, and organizer working across media and social practices. He's the co-founder and research director of Broken City Lab and principal of the new research studio Antagonism Works. His practice explores collaborative structures, critical pedagogy, and custodial frameworks as tools for enacting divergent possibilities for gathering, learning, and making. He holds an MFA from University of Windsor and is currently assistant professor in the Faculty of Culture and Community at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. I ask you to join me in welcoming Justin.
Okay. Hello, thanks for coming out. It's so nice to see some of you who I haven't seen for a while, and some of you who I saw on the walk over, and some people I haven't even met yet. So it's really nice to be in a room with such a great range of people. I want to kind of preface everything I'm going to say tonight with a note on where I'm coming from as an artist, as an educator, maybe as an organizer, which is to say that this is all kind of like in a state of becoming. These are not fixed points yet. They may one day be. Maybe with your help tonight, with some questions, they'll be more or less fixed at the end of it. But I think the idea here is to capture a sense of kind of thinking in real time with you guys. So I'm going to try and keep it as loose as I can, although I do have a bunch of notes to get through, so I'll try and keep it balanced, okay? So tonight I'm going to aim to connect a couple of discussions on antagonism and uselessness to try and provide us with a roadmap towards some ideas for processes and practices of engagement, right? And this for me is basically like, how can we act in the world? How are we going to act in the world differently tomorrow than we are today? So yes, these suggestions, these ideas are probably going to be kind of impractical. And no, they're not going to lead to any kind of drastic change. These are kind of provocations. And so we should really hold on to the sense of suggestions throughout the talk. But regardless of that contingency, I think that what these ideas may offer us is a set of new tools, or maybe better than that, an alternative set of instructions for using the tools we've already been using, if that makes sense. And hopefully that points us towards an expansion or a change or an adjustment of our creative and civic activities and forms of engagement, right? So I'm going to set some edges here. I think that uselessness slows down and impedes. It renders a distorted mirror image of what we consider to be useful. It is that thing, but then it's not really that thing anymore. It's a bike with two wheels, but then the wheels are actually triangles. And so, like, it was a bike, but now it's a useless bike. Antagonism disrupts and it refuses. It marks a clear line through its presence and makes unreasonable demands. It is sheer insistence, but it disavows any interest in articulating what it insists upon. It's like a harsh profanity with the fill in the blank after it. That's antagonism. Constantly that. So together, I think they're going to provide some strategies for making our activities in whatever expanded form you want to work with, okay? They're going to make those fundamentally uninteresting to power because of how slow they are and how enthusiastically they refuse. I think when we slow ourselves down, we also don't make any efforts to meet anyone halfway. And that's this is what this is going to be about. So now, sustaining any outside interest in what you're doing, when what you're doing is a known burden, it can be difficult. And that's the point, right? To kind of like continually set up this frustration. And crucially, this all necessarily hinges on making something just legible enough. So it's not about complete withdrawal, and instead it's more about consistently agitating within the structures we encounter. It's fighting with time in small iterative loops. Has anyone seen this before? Do you know what it is? What is it, Joe? It's called the Useless Machine. Yeah, absolutely. It's a device that performs basically the most useless task you can imagine, which is it just turns itself off. So you turn it on, and its whole role is to just say, no, you can't do that, and turning off. And, so this was invented by artificial intelligence researcher Marvin Minsky in 1952. And I just think it's kind of funny because even as far back as that, there's probably some sense that if this magical stuff called artificial intelligence is helping us to do a whole bunch of like important things today, that maybe even back then it needed some pick or some point at being short-circuited, right? So this is what I imagine was going through his head when he was figuring this out. And I think that the Useless Machine provides us with an example of the kind of intensity we need to work with. And that's not like a one-off, it's a constant response. So like every time you turn it on, it's ready to be turned off. Or it's ready to turn itself off, I should say. Okay, but so first, before I really try and dig in some more on what I'm trying to say, I want to frame my position a little bit more. And, so in the introduction, I'm an artist among many other things, but let me articulate a little bit more about what I think that means. And this quote captures some of that. Quote says, "In the end, art that stems from knowing that we actually don't have all the answers, art that refuses to serve as a moral compass, and art that doesn't make nice may be our best hope." And this comes from an article in Freeze a few years ago that was trying to problematize politically or socially engaged work, or any work that tries to make something better. I would imagine this expands into even a critical look at design practices. It generally accuses that form of work as being naive or misinformed, irresponsible, and I think that those are all topics for another night, or maybe beers afterwards. But tonight I wanted to bring it up because it captures a sense of refusal of certain expectations of what a creative practice maybe should do. And that resonates with me because in my work I've hit the sense of frustration that came from an expectation to make nice, I think. And that work comes from Broken City Lab. And there's a couple of my colleagues here tonight. My partner, Danielle, she's a co-founder, Danielle Sabelli, and then Hiba Abdallah, who flew in all the way from Windsor, Ontario for this talk, or at least that's what my ego is telling me. Has nothing to do with you visiting family. But anyway, so the work that Broken City Lab did was based on kind of interventionist tactics. It was focused for a while in Windsor, and it's since spread out into other cities momentarily. We were doing a project with the Contemporary Art Gallery's Fieldhouse earlier this year. And the work that we had been doing up until this particular project called Civic Space was really driven, I think, out of us encountering the city and trying to figure out what we want to say about that act of encountering, how we want to work our own concerns into a practice that's made public. But the problem was that the more of that work we did, the more legible it became, and the more clear it was how it was going to kind of be intersected with, right, by other organizations, other initiatives. And that became really dull because all of a sudden it kind of foreclosed a bunch of things we might want to do. Because it became, really important and interesting maybe to find different ways to work with community organizations, but it also really, it set some boundaries that I guess I got kind of bored with. And I think we all did to an extent. I think that's sort of why we're not really sure where this project is going. But initially, it was driven by antagonism. It was like, we don't like what's going on where we live. We want to talk about it, and we want to talk about it publicly without being invited. And so when you kind of lose that link, then it's something else. And I think this is not a Broken City Lab work, but I think this captures something really special, which is a real antagonism. So this was, these were some stickers that were printed and posted on street signs around Windsor, probably 3 or 4 years ago now. But what strikes me about this is that, it wasn't just that someone was, kind of disappointed enough with where they lived to put this, to like decide to do something. It was that they, went to Staples, got the sticker paper. They found the right template in Microsoft Word. They laid this out with some legibility. They went through the clip art library to find there was a lot of effort to just say, I don't like what's going on, let's all bail. And I think the way in which that antagonism was sustained over that entire project is super important. And it's that intensity and its refusal to really address the problem through its intensity that remains really interesting. Okay, so I'm going to try and mark some boundaries. And so then this is my example of marking a boundary, I guess, with a road sign. Okay, uselessness and antagonism are necessarily different tactics on the strategic field of this really wide term anti-capitalist resistance. Okay, and that's big and it's not super helpful within precisely what I'm talking about, but I just want to say that that's what I'm operating out of, and as we go on, maybe I'll be able to hone that in a little bit. These two words or ideas or things represent different tools that can be employed both defensively and offensively. Uselessness can aim to render something, some infrastructure, or some consumer experience useless, but it can also help to render yourself useless within an exchange, foreclosing all interest in you as a subject in the best possible way. Antagonism in its hostility articulates an auto-resistance to the issue at hand and evaporates any interest in approaching the issue with a containable or controllable empathy. It turns the mechanization that neoliberal capitalism insists upon into a mirror, reflecting back an inefficient or an efficient refusal that contains no leaks, no signal disruptions, no lunch breaks or weekends. So I'm going to try and work through both these ideas separately, and then I'm going to glue them back together at the end. Okay? Everybody ready? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Uselessness. Structured inefficiency. A time bomb in an archive. It's like this idea that it exists and then all of a sudden it doesn't because you broke it on purpose. There's a limit to when and how something can be used, and there should probably be a time in which something useless was actually useful, right? So it's that transition. I think that uselessness isn't about storming the gates, it's about putting potholes in the road leading up to the gates. It's about seeing a strategic arc and the banality of everyday practice. So when you start thinking about uselessness and you do some research, you run into this Chinese philosopher, this story. Shuangzi's, I always trip on this word, efficacious uselessness. Basically the practical benefits of useless form. So maybe this story is familiar. I'm kind of doing a bit of a summary here, but it's close enough that it'll resonate if you know it. So here it goes. A carpenter went to a village, and at the edge of the nearby forest, he saw a large oak standing by the village shrine. It was broad enough to shelter several thousand oxen and measured 100 spans around, towering above the hills. The carpenter, however, didn't even look at the tree and went on his way without stopping. His apprentice stood staring at this tree for a long time, and then ran after the carpenter and said, "Since I first took up my axe and followed you, master, I have never seen timber as beautiful as this. But you don't even bother to look at it. You go right on by without stopping. Why is that?" The carpenter says, "Forget about that tree. It's worthless. If you make boats out of it, they would sink. If you make coffins out of it, they would rot. It's not a timber tree. There's nothing it can be used for. That's how it got to be so old." After the carpenter returned home, he went to bed, and the oak tree appeared to him in a dream. And it said to him, "What are you comparing me with? Are you comparing me with those useful trees? The cherry, apple, the pear, the orange, the rest of those fruit-bearing trees and bushes? As soon as their fruit is ripe, they're torn apart and subjected to abuse. Their big limbs are broken off, their little limbs are yanked around. Their utility makes life miserable for them. And so they don't get to finish out their years. They're cut off in mid-journey. They bring it on themselves, the pulling and the tearing of the common mob, by growing so much fruit and doing it so well. As for me," the oak tree continued, "I've been trying for a long time to be of no use. And though I almost died, I finally got it. I am gnarled and twisted and quite useless for timber. But this is of great use to me. If I had been of some use, I would have never grown this big." So uselessness is a virtue. You set up a strategic condition under which you are of no identifiable or verifiable use to someone else, and so then you survive. But if uselessness is a virtue or a mode of survival, then we have to think, okay, what is useless now? And so you stumble across the useless web. Has anybody been on this site before? Nicole, it's kind of great, I think. I'll tell you why it's great in a moment. I'm wondering if the useless web is a strategy for survival. I don't think it is, but I'm wondering if we can find something useful towards a longer horizon in the immediacy of the web. Can the short-circuitedness offer us a glimpse of another way to be in the world because it's happening right now? I don't know. For example, this is a website where you drag your cursor across and you slap this guy with this eel. And I don't think it's actually a great idea, but I just think it's weird that a website like this exists. Or these weird black blobs that they're kind of doing this. And when you shake your mouse really fast, they do this. And this weird music plays. And I wonder, is it a meditation on the instrumentalization of our creative expression? What does it mean? But what does it mean? Okay. And then there's this. Oh no, there's no sound. It's so worth it to have the sound. I think so. Oops, I proved it. Okay, anyways, it's just like a sine wave that goes... I'm just doing it in real time. So looped uselessness. Oh. No dice. That's okay. Should I step back for a second? It's okay. Maybe. Do you want me to try the next one? It's even better.
It should be up.
That's too bad. This music's really great. It's like dun 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 dun. So I don't know. Maybe Puppy's running as survival, or maybe again that this is a website framed as part of the useless web. And maybe that fact that it is a useless web, that it offers us a place to consider a lack of resolution as a necessary leverage point in resistance. So it's the fact that the puppies run forever and with no goal in mind other than just running. It's that maybe there's some kind of expression of resistance in that. And then there's these useless things. A lot of them I feel are from a single catalog for Japanese trinkets or something. And but my favorite one is the one in the middle, the fan on the foe, because I actually think that maybe we've all thought of that at some point. It's kind of useful, right? So I'm a little uncertain about Google's organizing capacity here. But anyways, these all point to uselessness as an extra, right? As an excess. So it's not about survival, it's about the nature of excess in these forms of uselessness. It's about solving the problems of excess time and excess money. So you assume somehow that you have so much time and money that you need to buy these things to solve these problems, and maybe that's why they're useless. And that those expressions of excess exist regardless of your actual capacity to have those things like excess time or money. And then there's this, which is closer, I think. These are the kinds of things that run through my brain when I start thinking about like uselessness as a project. And these things have missing essential elements, and in turn it renders them useless, right? Or at least the rest of them, the rest of their parts. Things that were once useful and now turned useless. Their discrete examples may be leading up to one coherent and complete thought, or maybe just a bunch of random occurrences. But I think that if we think back to the oak tree, then maybe we can actually see that uselessness might require some strategy, right? So it can't just be one-off. You can't just pull the wings off one airplane. You have to consider the ways in which you could pull off the wings of every airplane. Strategy. There it is. Okay. So I'm going to turn to, this is I think a really interesting book, Jonathan Crary's 24/7, which suggests that even the one last remaining escape from the forces of neoliberal management structures and capitalistic forces is being compromised by an ever more demanding, on-demand expectation for how we live. And so he writes, billions of dollars are spent every year researching how to reduce decision-making time, how to eliminate the useless time of reflection and contemplation. This is the form of contemporary progress, the relentless capture and control of time and experience. So if neoliberal capitalism can always provide resolution, and as Crary might suggest, an efficient and constant resolution devoid of any reflection, I might argue that if you remove the possibility or interest for something to be resolved, you may be able to circumvent those structures of capitalism. It forces a perspective in which there cannot always be resolution and balance, that some things are unrecoverable and unattainable, and that through those experiences we can cultivate a sense of agency in that tension. We can find a way to be in the world that isn't contingent on capitalism. And frustration in this way helps us suspend the cloak of manufactured calmness and smoothness of a capitalistic reality, because capitalism can't be interested in co-opting people's frustration. And for sure, there are caveats. Things are going off in your brain. But I think that by and large, it's like capitalism would be uninterested in me being unhappy with what's happening in front of me. Frustration mounts a particular form of resistance, I think, because it pulls focus on a particular moment and sensibility, and it removes you as a productive component of an exchange. It creates a tension in which your attempts to resolve anything are found to be useless, and in my argument, this is ultimately emancipatory, right? But I think this interest in uselessness hinges on a sense of antagonism, maybe as a way to enter uselessness in the first place. So antagonism, you know this word. It's a sense of hostility that may result in a form of resistance. And I think that, to me, the one thing that I don't probably address entirely, but should be in the background, is that antagonism is experienced differently depending on the amount of power you have, right? So it's not a blanket kind of expression. It really depends on where you're coming from and how you're capable of acting. So we'll consider antagonism as a series of scattered and sharpened everyday forms of resistance expressed through useless gestures and founded on deep investments in tension and frustration. Now, to be sure, I do want to work with antagonism. You may be wondering if agonism is a better word here, right? And I think the setup I'm drawing from is related to Chantal Mousse writing on democratic pluralism. So she writes that in the structures that agonism provides as an ongoing and infinite battle over hegemonic control, quote, an adversary is an enemy, but a legitimate enemy, one with whom we have some common ground because we have a shared adhesion to the ethico-political principles of liberal democracy. End quote. So for me, antagonism is to enemy as agonism is to adversary. The only problem is that resistance as an idea or an action isn't seen as an adversary to, or an adversary, within a neoliberal hegemonic order, right? But rather it's likely already seen as an enemy. So, you know, agonism presumes that there's some common ground, some common set of values, and you meet, and it's like infinitely struggling. And I think that's really productive. But I'm kind of thinking like before you get there, you have to develop a sense of antagonism. You have to be able to figure out how to move that in a direction that's helpful for you. If an agonistic approach might aim to build the structures that can best facilitate adversarial exchange as a core component of the political experience, that is, rather than compromise and smoothness and meeting on common ground, well, there's still arguably some work to do, antagonistically speaking, before being able to attain that kind of adversarial environment. Anger is a gift that we have to receive before we can return the favor. And so maybe agonism is like an eventual aim, and we'll get there. But again, I think we need to start cultivating senses and expressions of antagonism first, because that is how we understand the ways in which we meet power. Our capacity for resistance is going to rely on our ability to get back in touch with some deep affective intensities. I'm going to try to suggest that it is within affective intensities driven by frustration that we might find the best way to sustainable resistance tactics. Feeling good through coming together is too easily compromised. Exploiting the uncontrollable and undistillable frustrations and tensions that arise from experiences we normally want to avoid, maybe that could offer us a way to act in gradual steps towards a larger goal of systemic disruption, or if we're really lucky, maybe even collapse, if we're really lucky. Okay, but first, I keep saying first. This is well into the first. Next, we're going to look at everyday antagonism. So, I don't know, is this a useful definition for anybody? This comes from an instruction manual for a video game called Crazy Climber. And this is one of the bad guys you got to dodge, I guess. And I thought it was great because it captures a really particular action. And it says this is what an antagonist does. You drop things on people you don't like. And, you know, there's something really violent in that, and I get it, but I think that the kind of simplicity of the assumed description here and kind of like what it immediately relays and kind of your imagination is productive. Or maybe this is more helpful, where it's like endless antagonism or cyclical antagonism. I mean, maybe for E. Honda, like antagonism as life practice. Maybe. Antagonistic practices might best be understood, though, as a way to organize our actions. That is, our actions as informed by shared experiences of frustration and anger, rather than a shared assessment of how we want to make something better. Further, I believe it might be more ethically sound to agree on what we don't like, rather than trying to agree on how we might fix it. And if we go back to Move's discussion of agonism, we can see that the goal is to provide a substrate or democratic infrastructure for constant hegemonic struggle. It's about recognizing, quote, that democracy is achieved not through pure consent or compromise, but through an acknowledgement of dissensus, the provisional role of hegemony, exclusion, and the inability to remove antagonism from politics, end quote. To suggest that it might be more ethically sound to agree on what we don't like, that is to basically agree on a shared sense of antagonism, affinity groups around things that frustrate you. This was the working model for Broken City Lab, essentially. Is to offer the idea that we cannot eradicate hegemonic struggle, nor can we rely on consent and compromise to create a democratic structure for us. We need to embrace the constancy of disagreement. To try and bring together senses of agreement on how to act disallows the capacities that might be built through independent action. This also recaptures that idea of discovering a sense of agency. We recognize something we don't agree with, we consider ways to encounter it, and we then act only on our own behalf to have that encounter. We don't mix up points of affinity with full-on allegiance. We act when and how we want to act in the ways that best address our experiences, meeting structures of power, rather than trying to extrapolate and overlay that experience onto other people. But this isn't about a lack of solidarity either. It's about the need to discover how you can act in the world before figuring out how to act in the world with other people. we can all too often forget, I think we forget that part all too often, and the danger of forgetting is, I think, most visible in things like #activism, where we begin to rely on a path already laid out, and that path is probably already compromised. So we need to find a path for ourselves, and how do we do that? Or maybe when do we do that? Well, I think, at least for me, it started in high school, and I wish I could say that this was a high school picture of me, but I just couldn't get that part together. So there's some random kids loitering under a no loitering sign. And the things that the environment of high school fosters, I think, are really important. It's like that space is a game of trying to embrace this antagonistic intensity that you have for the world, and then learning what to do with it at the same time and in real time with your peers. But it's like, you watch other people, but you end up, you kind of act for yourself. You're a selfish teenager. You're not thinking about how to bring other people together. You're just like, this is bothering me. I'm going to loiter. And then other people are like, well, I'm going to loiter for me too. I'm not loitering for you, man. This is my loitering. So I wondered if something like loitering, maybe, might provide us with a way to think about the experience of encountering your own sense of antagonism in like pure form. No goals, no outcomes, just no strategy, just literally standing around with your hands in your pockets. And precisely because you're not supposed to. Like that's the antagonism. This is like low risk kind of civic disobedience. And so I'm wondering, how do we carry this intensity we develop, and in my argument now we're developing in high school, how do you carry that forward? And so this is what's carried forward into university. This was one of the first things I saw at Emily Carr when I started teaching there a year ago. And I think there's a lot of frustration and antagonism built into this. It's this really kind of clear, like, asking the world, but asking yourself, because there's something fundamentally incorrect or bothering you with what's in front of you. And it reminded me of this, which was at the school I used to teach at the University of Windsor, which is even more antagonistic. And these things are irresolvable. That's the key here, is that you have these students who are like writing these kind of like going away letters out of anger. And there's nothing that they really want to do with that, and there's nothing you can do. It's just an expression of this isn't working. So in thinking about this irresolvable nature of this antagonism that I'm hoping blossoms over time, we're going to turn to this quote from Marissa Young. And this is in an interesting but small collection that I don't know how to say. I was debating about whether just avoiding if it's pro-agonist or if it's protagonist. It's technically a plus sign. If anybody's heard her say this, let me know after. And then the next time I won't be awkward like this for all of us. Anyway, so the quote says, "There's a great deal of attention politically, philosophically, culturally on agreement, concord, and consensus. Harmony is important, but sometimes what gets occluded, tucked away, ignored, or smooshed out is the role of disagreement, discord, dissent, and dissensus. If you repress the dark, you aren't aptly depicting reality." And I think that this is really true, because if we are constantly working to resolve and towards consensus, we're turning every issue into a non-issue, kind of, right? It's like it's the meeting ground. It's the thing that's left once we all stop being angry or frustrated. And I think we lose some of the potentiality that's built into antagonism. So it's about trying to suspend or hold on to that blossoming frustration and understanding its useless capacity, its tendency to derail and refuse. It offers us a way to think about agreement and in turn to think about what other moves are on the table, right? So we stop thinking about agreement and we imagine there's some other stuff. Okay, so some questions that will further confuse things. When we think about entering an understanding of uselessness based on a practice of antagonism, and that is to say when we know our interest in uselessness is based on a frustration with constantly being made useful, we can carry with us a rationale for why we should enact uselessness. So, first question, what is useless education? Useless education might be any form of, we're going to say post-secondary education to start with, that doesn't turn into a job. There's no direct translation. That might be a form of useless education. And I think this is a really familiar argument, and it's like asking why get a degree in art when you could get a degree in design and have a job. That doesn't exist. but there's an imagination. There's a political imagination that design jobs exist after design school. Okay, or it might be considered things like English departments, which teach fundamental skills in terms of instrumental structures like grammar and spelling, stuff like this, but it's not in and itself job-inducing, right? So it's kind of this skill that needs to be translated, and it's a kind of core skill or competency. But maybe if we turn uselessness on its head, we'll get somewhere else in terms of education. So there's an article that circulated in the New Yorker that was kind of responding to this challenge or provocation that arts and humanities education is useless, it's over. Don't need to worry about it. We just let it slowly wither and die, and people keep enrolling in engineering, and that'll be better. And so a writer in the New Yorker responds and says, so why should English majors exist? Well, there's really no whys to such things, any more than there are whys to such things like why we wear clothes, or paint good pictures, or live in more than hovels and huts, or send flowers to our beloved on their birthday. No sane person proposes or has ever proposed an entirely utilitarian, production-oriented view of human purpose. We cannot merely produce goods and services as efficiently as we can. We sell them to each other as cheaply as possible and then die. This can't be the model. Some idea of symbolic purpose, of pleasure-seeking rather than rent-seeking, of doing something else is essential to human existence. So maybe useless education is both lack of productive potential, but also the immeasurability of it. Okay, what is useless activism? Useless activism might be seen in actions, and this first one might be more or less contentious than this. This will be the punchline at the end. Useless activism might be seen in actions like trying to advocate for the banning of plastic bags, wherein its impact versus effort is negligible in terms of what it does to achieve the larger goals of the stated target. That, what it's trying to do, it's like, is this really helping? I don't know. Maybe a little bit, but there's a lot of energy and intensity put around it, and a lot of political capacity eaten up in conversations about that as municipalities try to ban these things. I am in favor of the ban, for the record. Okay. And wherein the efforts to support it may actually siphon energy from more valuable efforts. Or in this way, consider the hashtag activism like Coney 2012, or more recently, Bring Back Our Girls, which allows one to kind of front a certain level of support that never gets mobilized beyond our screens. But then on the other hand, you might think about the calls from media sources around the beginning of Occupy, and certainly in some of the echoes of that. A kind of a deep request for what do you want? Who's the leader? Who can we talk to? Give us a quote. And its uselessness or its disinterest in being legible, I think, was one of the more compelling things about Occupy. What is useless art? Well, useless art might be found in art made for oneself with no intention of circulation, insofar as it's unlikely that it will translate into a market and become useful. Or it might be any art that does not fit under ideas like art utile or Tanya Bruguera's useful art, where, this is a quote from her manifesto, the usefulness we are talking about in useful art is about the immersion of art directly into society with all of our resources. Useful art is a way of working with aesthetic experiences that focus on the implementation of art in society, where art's function is no longer to be a space for signaling problems, but the place from which to create the proposal and implementation of possible solutions. So if that sounds interesting to you, and more interesting than what I'm trying to argue for, you should look up Tanya Bruguera. She's a great artist. But it's a kind of counterpoint to some of the things I'm trying to think about. So useless art might hinge on failing to circulate, or on some retention to only signaling problems and not acting on implementation plans. So I consider this to be both an asset and a liability. Ultimately, these questions probably all leave us too much wiggle room, right? Everyone had well, there's this way, and then there's this way. So let me try again. Some better questions. And I think that these are going to take antagonistic intensities as completely connected and fundamental to expressions of uselessness in these spaces. So that is to say, when thinking about uselessness in education, activism, or art, we understand that our thinking is driven by the frustrations and antagonisms produced by the power structures embedded in them. Or maybe the lack of power structures. So I ask, where is uselessness in education and what does it foster? If we ask about uselessness in education rather than useless education, and what it might foster, we open up a different kind of conversation. We can start to see it more as a direct confrontation with the instrumentalizing forces of market logic and neoliberal tendencies of just about every post-secondary education institution, and really at the secondary level as well. So uselessness in education retains its location within those structures, but finds new ways to exploit them. It hones skills and discussions that cannot be so easily fit into larger narratives of job training. It would be hard but not impossible to argue that a seminar on, for example, piracy and studies in global modernism that Jamie Hilder is currently offering at Emily Carr is vitally useless, right? There's no way that you can exploit a study on piracy as a way to think about global modernism. I mean, I don't know what that translates into in a market setting, and that's really great. So beyond the content of education, where else might we imagine a role for uselessness as resistance training? So to draw on our image here, maybe it's in a shop class in which you're not allowed to actually make anything. It's just these kinds of activities, hours on end, sawing boards for no reason, gluing little pieces of wood together for no reason. You never develop any linking skills. These are all discrete things, and so there's never a greater knowledge. It's just these acts over and over. Or maybe if we go to the other end of the workshop, it's a series of workshops in a workshop with no tools at all. So you show up and there's nothing to work with, and so you have to encounter that. Or maybe it's like a mandatory non-credit course, and I'm thinking about an art school context. It's a mandatory non-credit course on the strategic theories of chess that runs at the exact same time as a professional practices course, disallowing anyone from ever learning any professional skills to instrumentalize their art in the market context. Or a course that meets spontaneously in traffic jams. These all seem like useless strategies. Uselessness in education fosters a way to rethink and steal back time away from productive logics and likely hinges its experience in deep frustration. So when is uselessness in activism, and what does it make time for? This is a picture back in Windsor from the 1945 labor strike at Ford. And it reminded me of maybe something you guys are familiar with, the autonomous in Bologna that did a lot of really intensive and kind of useless gestures towards, I think, trying to corrupt sites of sort of state control. But they did this one kind of intervention where they hacked all of the streetlights so that the prime minister who was being kind of paraded through town couldn't be moved. So there was a traffic jam that they created. And that's kind of what this reminded me of. But anyways, when we ask when is uselessness in activism and what does it make time for, we maybe find an answer in the strike, right? Insofar as it renders useless potential labor. The now winding down pro-democracy Occupy Central protests in Hong Kong rendered large amounts of public space temporarily useless as infrastructure for the flow of goods and services. And it also withdraws time from the flow of capital. So when students or workers, when they're at a protest, they're not working or preparing to work. Uselessness as a mandate in activism might give us something else, though. And so this is even maybe more useless in that maybe Jonathan Crary would suggest sleep as activism. I might wonder about solitaire on Windows 98 as activism, or BuzzFeed as like a constant activism. I don't know. Uselessness experiences moments of stealing back time, right? And wasting that time. But it's not really enough, is it? True uselessness in activism might take the form of rendering something as a near use. And I was talking about this earlier, right? It has to be the bike before it can be the bike with triangular wheels. So uselessness in activism might make time for considerations of other ways to live and act together, by withdrawing not only from the infrastructures that give shape to the activist practices, like forces like labor management, pipelines, and inaction on climate change, but also from the fallout of channeling our energy towards those legible concerns. So once you're acting in support of an identified issue, your capacity to act beyond it is diminished because it's already contained and framed, right? So a hack group or a hacktivist group like Anonymous is interesting because you probably never see them coming, and it's super hard to understand any strategic direction that they may have. Withdrawing from clear outcomes and goals makes it a lot harder for your efforts to be contained and instrumentalized, but it also also necessarily less effective within the equations we normally set out for ourselves in relation to success of like certain activist campaigns. So where is uselessness in art and where does it lead us? Or how is uselessness in art and where does it lead us? I think it might offer a roadmap for truly radical artistic practices and the events, objects, and ephemera they produce in the way that it can so easily lift out of a market logic and the power structures embedded in that logic by short-circuiting or misuse. And so I'm going to pull from Boris Groys teasing out something around this on an Eflux essay on art activism. He says, quote, "The French revolutionaries, instead of destroying the sacred and profane objects belonging to the old regime, they defunctionalized it, or in other words, they aestheticized them. The French Revolution turned the design of the old regime into what we call art today. Basically, objects not of use, but of pure contemplation." And he continues, in an art context, to aestheticize the things of the present means to discover their dysfunctional, absurd, unworkable character. Everything that makes them non-usable, inefficient, and obsolete. End quote. So making of non-usable and inefficient things provides a model to exercise our useless antagonisms, carving out art as a space to transform the useless present into something useless, or I should say the useful present into something useless. Something that adds unnecessary time and delays to the thing in front of us, and something that is deeply positioned to alter our experiences towards something that can escape a market logic. And I think uselessness is already built into the practice of art. I think that quote offers some hint at what that might be, but there's probably a lot more nuanced examples of art as a really great site to explore uselessness because of the kind of ever-expanding field or terrain that it can cover. And I think art readily provides us with examples from which we might extrapolate into larger practices of everyday life. So it's like a test site, maybe. So not unlike the argument about the English department or the use or uselessness of it, I think a measure of use is necessarily compromised as soon as we begin thinking as humans. And that's really important, right? Okay, so I'm going to wrap up in the next few slides here. Maybe these are some, dare I say, useful things to consider. Okay, I'm going to let you enjoy this for a moment and take another sip of water. Think about antagonism. Okay, so Henri Lefebvre in Production of Space writes the following, quote, "Pressure from below must confront the state in its role as an organizer of space, as the power that controls urbanization, the construction of buildings, and spatial planning in general. The state defends class interests while simultaneously setting itself above society as a whole, and its ability to intervene in space can and must be turned back against it by grassroots opposition. And this should come in the form of counter-plans and counter-projects, designed to thwart strategies, plans, and programs imposed from above." So it needs to be constant, right? It needs to be strike and counter-strike. And we need to come up with these counter-plans and counter-projects that Lefebvre suggests we take on. And that needs to happen always and all of the time. So here are some really useless suggestions, okay? Number one, write counter-proposals. This is direct, right? This is, what do you do with Lefebvre? Okay, write counter-proposals and submit them alongside your actual proposals, highlighting the difference resulting in the language of the call or the grant. So I'm thinking of everything from trying to refute the definitions that you might run into in a grant to all out antagonizing the expectations baked into those forms in the first place. And more deeply, making your grant applications dismissible in the first place because you submit two, and then you refuse to respond and pick one, so they just have to throw them both out, but it slows it all down. Okay, number two, slow down experiences that are already displeasurable, avoiding any space that might be of interest to mindfulness or slow movement capitalism. So think about pumping gas really slowly. Like you're doing a crossword, and every time you find an answer, you pump another liter into the tank. Or maybe something where you go to the bank and you get into this cycle of activity where every day you take $1,000 in that new plastic money and you ask for it in nickels, and then the next day you bring the nickels back and you ask for it in a money order to yourself, and then the next day you cash the money order for the $1,000 again. And it's not about slowing down to a joy, because that is already capitalized. It's like there are lots of books and blogs about how to live slowly better, and so that's gone now. We can't take that back. So we have to do this other stuff. And it's about slowing down for the sake of frustration, because then the frustration is when we lift out of these moments, or we lift out through moments of like misreading or misunderstanding capitalism. It's about slowing down for the sake of both you and the people you're interacting with, and for the sake of the structures of power they represent. Okay, number 3. Take a meeting, and regardless of the meeting or the content of that meeting, around the halfway point, insist on reviewing the process at hand for the sake of transparency and diligence, and completely unravel any productivity. So there's no more talking about the issues at hand. You get bogged down in process. So it's like this: having a meeting about when to file your next report. Raise a discussion point that tries to argue for the need to accommodate other forms of reporting. Ask about resources to turn in an oral or video report, or a report via Twitter. And assuming that's accommodated for some reason at this weird place you work, then the next time you turn around and you do the opposite, and you say, no, we need to get back to like written reports. This is ridiculous. It's too distributed. I'm not watching the videos anyways. And you repeat this over and over, these loops. Okay, number 4, add noise back into the signal. So this is like misreporting news stories, or signing into Google and searching for things you have no interest in, or adding broken links to trending hashtags. Make sure that you, maybe this is an example for tonight, you always ask questions in a public setting, especially if you think your question is slightly off base or really rooted in a conversation that you want to have actually at a different time. So it's like thinking about filibustering all of the time. Right? Everything is a moment to filibuster and distract and like pull away from this like smoothness in capitalism. Number 5, block traffic everywhere all the time. All forms of traffic and circulation should be blocked in the streets, with your cars or bikes or bodies. Everything's fair game. It's antagonizing traffic as regulating structures and patterns and rendering them useless. Because we need to figure out how to cultivate these moments, these expressions of like, I am so livid about what's going on, and then you remember what it is to be human. Right? Tell me the last time that you got angry and you weren't like the most present you've been the whole week. That's what this is about. And maybe as a bonus, sleep more. Find more time for sleep, and remember Little Nemo, the video game. And that's it. So I'm very happy to take any questions and have a conversation. Yeah, let's get into it a little bit.
Someone's got to have a question.
Yeah, this is great, right? This is precisely the thing. I can't walk away with anything helpful if you, if you don't like meet me halfway. Question.
There's a certain irony in advocating for uselessness. The kind of, an intent to be useless.
Right.
You think there's a certain kind of irony in that, because I think there's a kind of similarity between some of your ideas. I mean, I like, first of all, I like your talk and I like your ideas. I just want to start thinking about how it's often, these distinctions are often put in the discourse of play versus whatever, productivity. But play is productive, and there's a lot of discourse around now, even in leadership, about the effectiveness of play in the creative process for the sake of innovation and that kind of thing. So your kind of your useless strategies, if you will, that you've kind of put up here are interesting to me. They're a little bit ironic because they're sort of being intentionally useless, which is actually quite useful.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that I had a lot of trouble figuring out how to frame where, like, what you were going to hinge on in terms of understanding use in the first place, right? And because I think that for sure almost anything you can come up with can sort of immediately be turned on its head and kind of plugged into a productivity market logic thing, right? Like this, these are maybe very creative ideas that you could, an artist can be thinking about in terms of art school that actually makes them a really great innovator and like totally primed for their MBA or whatever. But I think that the question of where to situate this stuff, is it sincere? Is it really actually kind of a big joke? I mean, what do we walk away with in some ways because everything's compromising itself as soon as it's articulated? I think that the idea, to maybe circle back to the very beginning, was that the work in Broken City Lab, which involved everything from very temporary interventions or projections on buildings of statements from us and from the community to more infrastructural things like hosting artist residencies, they were always most compelling to us when we were deciding to do it one day and then actually doing it the next. And as soon as that gets stretched out because you have people who want to help you do it the next day, then it's kind of not that thing anymore because you're doing it with them and for them as well. And there's a selfishness that I think is helpful to hold on to, because as soon as we started that civic space project that I showed a picture of, which you have no context for, but it was a storefront, and we brought artists through and tried to also bring in people who weren't artists, but civic leaders around our age, people who were thinking about what do you do in a city that's hard to care about. As soon as we did that and the funding that was required for it, we were kind of like, well, I mean, geez, anybody could have done this. I mean, it didn't require an artist collective to come up with a storefront and invite other people to come and do stuff in it. And so that's kind of the thing is once we got to this point where it was really clear that what we were doing was interesting to other people and quite useful for a whole bunch of other agendas and mandates, it's well, how do you compromise some of that from the beginning? Or how do you embed a sense of antagonism into something like that? And I know this is a long answer, but just because it's connected, a new project that is unfolding soon or shortly in Philadelphia is a residency I'm curating called Neighborhood Time Exchange. And the basis of this is to invite artists in to a poor neighborhood that has a lot of federal dollars being leveraged towards art and placemaking, okay, which are fair enough. Those are important goals for some people. But the residency sets up that for every hour an artist spends in their studio, they need to give an hour back to service that the community wants done. So it's not about artists going in and trying to make art projects that might help a community. It's about saying, no, there should be some antagonism there. There should be some a little bit of a call on that's unlikely that your art is going to help them in a real measurable way. So if that's part of what we're imagining that socially engaged practice, for example, might do, then let's actually pull those out, pull them apart and say, there can be a space for art, and it can just be art, or it can involve other people. But there is a space where the resources that you are leveraging through being in a poor neighborhood are being kind of re-leveraged in their favor, because there's no way to access $500,000 to do small projects like paint people's porches unless it's filtered through an artist residency.
Antagonism can also be thought of as kind of dynamic tensions.
Yeah.
So if you allow for a multiplicity of utility, for instance, if people have a variety of different reasons for why they're doing what they're doing, in other words, some of them vague, some of them specific, but allowing them all not to resolve into a central one, and allowing a group of people to do that still with some kind of commitment to community or general response, then I think that can be interesting. It won't be centralized, narrow, exploited, precisely because it remains dynamic and diverse and idiosyncratic.
Yeah, dynamic tension. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, David.
When you were talking earlier on in your talk, lecture, I was thinking about, it was resonating with what I understand as Rosalind Deutsch's ideas about how democracy functions best when there are dynamic tensions or when the disagreements are the most vehement and strong, and then that's a sign that our system may be lurching along somewhat usefully. If I may just insert the use word into Rasan Deutsch's mouth. So the question that I'm thinking about is how to see that. How do you see these kind of agonism and antagonism relationship in the face of, perhaps, if you may agree with me just for the sake of this argument, hyperpolarizing positions that are intractable, or seemingly intractable, that these positions are getting increasingly polarized.
Right. So that they're so far apart.
Right. That and as our plural multiple points of view that are reinforced, positively reinforced through our media, that we selectively choose what reinforces our values to begin with. And if that is increasing these polarities, how do you see that, first of all, in relation to your agonistic and antagonistic binary model in this plural positioning, but also in relation to the polarization in a meta level?
Okay, hold on to the mic because I may need some clarifications as you go. So, yeah, it's like what kind of world are we cultivating when we like and when basically we can only like things, right? I mean, is there a dislike button on Facebook? I feel like that was a conversation from many moons ago. But when you're in an online space, when you're allowed to like reinforce positive feedback loop the opinions you already have, I mean, arguably yes, you would end up polarizing yourself further. And I think in some ways it's like, is the polarity so far that you don't even like notice the other side? Is agonism possible? And I think that this was a really hinging point for me in terms of Moof's argument, is that it's like it requires that there's a mutual respect or an understanding that like you see each other not as like the thing to be destroyed, but that it's really important to continually enter into this like hegemonic engagement or struggle, because that's how you cultivate a pluralistic democracy. This is the way to achieve the ends that we want, which is not a two-party system, for example. But I'm just trying to piece together, and maybe this is why you could rephrase the question. I think I'm kind of losing the thread, or how I should.
What you just said as a response, holding onto the mic reluctantly, is aside from two-party system and going to a three- or four-party system,
right,
or multiple party systems, is our question period a good example of antagonism at work?
No, actually, it's funny. I took out, or I must have, this was another one of these ideas or what to do, and it was like, I don't know if this is not a great occasion to think about antagonism per se, although I think it's a way to example what it could look like, or maybe because it is tending to be so polite that it's closer to agonism, I guess. But I had this thought that it's like, okay, so another useless thing is like you run for office, you create a municipal politics party on a really great campaign platform, you get into office, and then you resign the next day or something. It's like you do all of the work, and then you kind of foreclose the possibility that what that might be, because and in that you suggest that it's not that hard to like come up with, and I mean, I'm really not providing a nuanced argument of this, but it's not that hard to decide to act in that space, but it's actually really hard to step away and withdraw and just say, you know what, the most antagonistic thing you can probably do if you are elected as a politician is to, and if you have support, is to like step away from it entirely and not even participate in that system.
Unless you're a woman. if you think about, just as you're talking about the political process, and I'm thinking about Trish Kelly running for office, running for Parks Board. And I was just at a talk last week about women, the absence of women in the political system. And as she was running to participate, there was a smear campaign about her history in terms of sex activism, and you guys are familiar with this, yeah? So I guess this idea of refusal is really interesting to me, but then it also makes me think about the way that power is distributed already and the barriers that already exist.
Yeah, I think that's and this is the frustration I think that comes up in having this kind of conversation, is that it's like, okay, yeah, you can say that you're basically just going to, like, whatever comes up, you're going to try and mess with it, but that doesn't erase that thing, right? It's like it's still in front of you, you still have to deal with it, and it's moving on regardless of your participation or your attempts to short-circuit it. And so that's, I don't know that that's completely resolved in what I'm thinking, and partially it's a disinterest in trying to resolve it at this point, because it's maybe really another conversation to have. It's like what I've tried to lay out probably makes a lot of assumptions about how we want to act, and a lot of it's quite speculative and imaginative, and probably would be a really terrible place to actually live. But in a short-term order, I don't think it says, no, we can't also operate in these other spaces. I'm just wondering, like, if we're just constantly trying to meet what's already laid out, are we forgetting to leave room to, like, imagine what else we might do? But at the end of the day, it's still, like, that system is still there.
Okay. So I'm not entirely sure I have, like, the question. Oh, shit. Anyways, revenge. So if you're deliberately being sort of antagonistic for the purpose of revenge, like if someone makes you really angry and, okay, say they said, like, you're not a real artist, like, you don't know how to do that, whatever, and maybe you really sucked as an artist, and then you got really good as an artist because you're like, I just want to prove that person wrong. And you kind of like do these things for the purpose, or you act in an antagonistic manner for the purpose of just kind of proving someone wrong. It's like a structured antagonism. Is it? How does revenge factor into anything?
I don't know. It's a really great question, because it's a word that I think a lot of the things that I suggested might feel like they are a form or an expression of revenge, and yet I never, or revenge against this kind of like inanimate, but completely corralling force. But I never really thought of it in those terms. And I guess I'm thinking of like the video game antagonist dropping. What was he dropping out of windows? Just pin. Yeah. So, like when you're the climber, like, is it revenge if you go and, like, jump on the antagonist to, like, stomp him out? I don't know. Okay, so that wasn't a very helpful way through that question. So if the question was if your act of revenge is in the model of being a bad artist to be a good artist to prove somebody wrong, is that antagonistic? Was that it? Kind of? So I think that where antagonism is probably most useful is in maybe it's like plotting the revenge is where antagonism is like really happening in terms of what I'm thinking about, because it's not about always enacting stuff. It's like bringing that intensity towards actions and useless actions. So maybe rather than revenge, in my imagination of like taking what you suggested, I would say like, a useless antagonistic response would be to get really good and like make a bunch of art and like try and get this person to buy it, and then say that it was actually your kid that made it, and so it doesn't have any value anymore. And maybe that would be the best kind of revenge in that setting. Okay, good answer, Justin. Okay.
I was wondering if you'd thought about the absurd at all in relation to uselessness. And I'm not entirely sure how, but when you're talking about like the bicycle with triangle tires, it seems absurd to watch you try and ride a bicycle with triangle tires, but I feel like it'd be very frustrating and annoying if I had to do that, or if there were, or if everyone had to do that.
Yeah.
If there's some line between the absurd and uselessness.
Yeah, that's a great question. These are great keywords to that I think I'm going to try and wrestle with. And I think that in some ways, in the model I presented, it often still includes your like you experiencing that thing that you're laying out there. So I mean, I think it is about making a bike with triangle wheels, but then like you're the rider as well, right? And it's like, and what's at stake is your inability to get anywhere quickly, more than a thing that you put out into the world and somebody else has to deal with solely. Like when you go to the bank and you do this stupid self-money laundering thing, it's like you are trying to do something there, but you're also doing it to yourself. When you pump gas really slowly, it's like it's eating into your day as well. But the other forces that depend on your time in the day are also affected, and that's kind of what's exciting or interesting to me.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Right now, Gumben's doing a lot of writing on sort of withdrawal and loitering, and for him, in the way that he talks about it, sort of the subtraction or the withdrawal is linked to a kind of political agency or a kind of political potency. And then for somebody like Badu, subtracting yourself from the state is a way of reclaiming a kind of political subjectivity or creating a political truth outside of that. In the way that you talk about it, how do you see some relation in your work or the way that you're describing this notion of withdrawal and uselessness as some kind of an activation, even in its uselessness?
Yeah. And thanks for those links, because they are, I think the next level of this is to try and construct some scaffolding to support some of these ideas. And I would say that for sure. I mean, the active withdrawal is absolutely about articulating a kind of political agency, because you are, in my mind, rather than attaching yourself to something that's pre-articulated and existing, you're saying there's a lot to be learned from me being outside of this and finding my own way through it. And I'd be interested to figure out more about how it might resolve, what Helen was kind of asking. It's like, in that withdrawal, something happens, but it's a math equation where there's a remainder one way or the other, and what you're left with is, if you withdraw, then there's a gap that you left, and something's added over here, but you can't fill the gap back in there. Thanks for those. That's great.
We've got time for 2 more questions.
Thanks. Thanks so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And I have a question. I kept on thinking about the Welfare Challenge, which is coming up next week, and from the 16th to the 22nd of October. And this is where people who aren't living on income assistance are invited to eat, as if they were on income assistance for the week. I think, Am, you were one of the early people involved in that in Vancouver. Oh, you weren't. And I was thinking about that as filibustering, in the terms that you were talking about. And so it's demonstrating capacity to resist your own privilege in capitalism. And Friday in this room, there was a really interesting talk that connects. The philosopher Howard K. Gill was encouraging us not to use the word or the concept resistance anymore. He has a new book which is called On Resistance, but instead to encourage people's capacity to resist. He was really specific about that. And one example that came up at the end of his talk was a prisoner who objects to how they're being treated and is punished, maybe put into solitary confinement, for instance, but in doing so, they might have enhanced other people's capacity to resist. At the same time, they may well have demoralized the other prisoners, and so it's not possible to know in advance the way that this enhancement of capacity to resist may work out for people. What do you think?
I mean, those are all really great points, and I think maybe there's a link to what Am had kind of asked and where I tried to resolve that, which is like there's, the chance that you might inspire others, or you might actually do some damage to what's at stake, or their ability or capacity to act within that, is, I think, like a very real challenge. And yet it's like and I didn't go to the lecture, but I kind of heard some of the conversations for people who went to the lecture, and so I'm sure I'm getting just bits and pieces of it. But it seems to me that maybe there's a blind spot in terms of it assumes a bit of a contagion effect to what you do. And I think a prison is a very poignant example of how that might be possible. But in other settings, I don't always know if it's that translatable, and especially depending on how you choose to broadcast something. I think a lot of these are kind of like anti-broadcasts. They're really meant to be like, your own private playbook, and maybe the person next to you is the same one, but maybe not. So the fact that they don't know that what you're playing, it maybe means that they won't see it as something. But that being said, that really makes it seem like people don't have capacity to read what activities are going on. So I guess I'm stymied a little bit by that. But it's a really, I think the gaps that you identified there in relation to like you maybe gain capacity, or you maybe like actually lead to people being demoralized, is really interesting. Thank you.
We've got time for one more question.
Back where it began. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about your interest in this, whether it's principally for you a matter of your creative practice, because it's there that I find these ideas most interesting. Mm-hmm. When they cross over into the political domain, they become, I think, a little more problematic.
Yeah.
Like the idea of filibustering or stonewalling.
Absolutely.
And antagonism at state level of politics can have very damaging effects. But in a creative environment, it can be very interesting, productive.
Totally. And I mean, I think a lot of this is me thinking through like what room is there left, or what happens next, or what do I want to pursue that that feels like it won't be easily instrumentalized, basically. Because there are things I can do that could be really legible, and that's fine. And I may enter a situation with that awareness and with that intention, but it's the slippage of when you're trying to do something that speaks at a certain volume or to a certain kind of set of problems, and then someone else finds a way to use that for their own kind of positioning that's problematic. And so I think large-scale politics, there's huge gaps and holes. But I also think that on a much smaller scale, and I'm thinking of a Skype meeting that Hibba and I were on about another project, and Hibba being one of my collaborators in Broken City Lab that's up here at the front. And we were trying to discuss another residency project where there were some problems about if an artist or group of artists were going to be removed from the project because of some challenges. And it was a conversation that was so frustrating to be having because, we didn't believe in where it was going. It was really, maybe I'll speak more on behalf of myself, but I had thought that this really was not a great move. And so as the conversation unfolded, and we had been Skyped in to have some sort of debate about it, I guess, we just didn't talk. And so the conversation couldn't move. So eventually they had to resolve it themselves, and to an extent, we were able to say, well, like, we're not consenting to this, but you also never got an opinion out of us, so you have to resolve that. And that is challenging on a whole bunch of other levels, but that's sort of where some of this seems like it might bleed out beyond a creative practice into a lived experience. So thanks a lot for all your attention, for hanging in there. Thanks.